This is the last message in a series called One is Greater Than Two, One Greater Than Two. That's a marriage series. And so this last few weeks, we've just been engaging in the conversation about marriage and this awful math formula that doesn't seem to work, right? You'd score a 0 on your math test in school if you show up and said this. But the reality is that oftentimes what God creates, the economy of God, is very different than what we kind of logically pursue. And so we called it this, One is Greater Than Two, because we want to talk about marriage as it's defined by God, as it was created by God, and as it's designed for us. You know, how we can experience what's really oneness and the one together in marriage. So the last few weeks we've done that. The first week, Roland came. Roland is a director of Christian Family Life, and he came and brought us our first message. And he's actually a part of the material we're going to be doing for a Connect group. Casey and Lori are going to be leading a Connect group called Two Becoming One. And that's from Christian Family Life Ministries. And so if you want to sign up for that, you can sign up for that online. It's like the third banner on our main page, or you can go to the Connect group page and get on that and sign up for it. Start in the next couple weeks. I think it's an 8-week or 10-week study this fall. So it's called Two Becoming One. But Roland, a part of that ministry, he actually brought the first message and helped us really kind of see the foundational purpose behind marriage as it was created. So here's what he gave us. That the purpose of marriage was to reflect the image of God. That, when he took us back to Genesis and he talked about Adam and Eve, we were created, man and woman were created in God's image, so we're all image bearers. We carry the image of God in us individually, but there was something special and unique about how God chose to create Adam and how God chose to create Eve. And then when he brought them together, this oneness, this marriage, when he brought them together, it was for a reflection of the fullness of God to a watching world. There was nothing else in creation that he gave this specific charge to. And so this is, for us, a reflection of God. That's why we consider marriage to be a very important conversation. That marriage is created and was designed, purposed to be a reflection of God. And then Zach last week talked and kind of dove right into some of the struggles that we have in marriage and understanding marriage because he wanted to talk about where oneness really comes from. And he said this, oneness, right, this joining together in one, is a covenant love for each other. Oneness can be best described as a covenant love for each other. And I thought he did a great job last week. You can go back and watch the fullness, but explaining the marriage ceremony, that when you don't understand what a covenant is, the covenant you're entering into, it's really just a contract, just a contractual promise and vow to each other, where you'll do your bit and I'll do my bit, and you said yes and I said yes, versus a covenant where when you really start looking at the marriage ceremony, you are actually saying yes to God. You're saying yes to the representative of what you vow you will do before you even vow to do that for the other person. It's a covenant love. And that's where oneness really comes from in terms of the Christ-centeredness, the way God designed marriage to be. Now, he used this word. This is just a word we use because we use oneness, and most people don't think about their marriage practically in terms of oneness. We think about it more in terms of connection, intimacy, deep connection. That's some of the more language that we use. And so when Zach talked about it last week, he gave us this understanding that, hey, true intimacy, this oneness, is the unbroken covenant with God and each other. That's the end result. It's this unbroken covenant with God and with each other that kind of is a mystery to most, that don't understand how God designed marriage. But we get that intimacy, we get that true reflection of oneness in our life when we make that covenant, when we understand. It's funny, I talk about this with premarital, anybody who's been in here, they know this, but if you've been married, and I did your premarital counseling, we do 3 sessions. In the first session, I ask couples a question at the very beginning, and I don't let them answer it right away. I let them wait till the very end of the session to answer it. And the question I ask right at the very beginning, and I'm looking at these two, young, and sometimes they're not so young, but I'm looking at these two folks, and they're getting married, and I look at them and I say, okay, I want you to tell me this at the end of the session. What makes this person, what makes her, what makes him the one? Like what makes your marriage, this marriage you're getting ready to walk into, what is it going to be that makes it defy all the statistics? That's not just going to be another number. Like what makes the difference? What makes them the one? And then I just let them sit and squirm the whole time, the whole session. They're trying to come up with a really good answer, And at the end of the session, I hear it's all this, you complete me, and all this kind of fun stuff. It's all this fun stuff they say, and of course I affirm it because I'm like, no, all those things are true. Everything they say is true. But then I start talking about the covenant of marriage, and most couples just sometimes don't really fully get that, listen, the covenant of marriage is what's going to make the difference. When you understand the covenant you're making, that is the difference maker, the change maker as to how you're going to be not just another statistic when it comes to marriages. And when Paul describes this relationship, and Paul in Ephesians, he actually quotes Jesus, when Jesus was quoting God the Father in Genesis. And he talked and gave us a picture of what this kind of covenantal, unbroken covenantal love and oneness could look like. Here's Ephesians 5. He says, and furthermore, this is continuing a thought, he says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Now this was a common Christian call. It's a mutual submission as Christians. But he said you're going to up the ante because it's going to happen in your marriage relationship too. For wives, this means to submit to your husband as unto the Lord. You're going to submit to him as you are submitting to God. And then a little bit later on, he says, for husbands, this means to love your wives just as Christ loved the church. He gave up his life for her. The self-sacrificing, unconditional love you're called as husbands to make. And then he goes on to say a little bit later, he says, hey, the scriptures say this. This is where he's quoting Jesus, who's quoting Genesis. A man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. The two become one. And it says this is a great mystery, but it's the picture, it's the illustration, right? It's the reflection of the way Christ and the church are one. And he ends this passage saying, so again I say each man must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. A great book on this is a book called Love and Respect. It's a great book that talks a little bit about the circle of how respect fuels love, and love fuels respect, and respect fuels love, and love fuels respect, in terms of how this covenant relationship, how this covenant marriage works. And now for you and I, listen, the reality is this is not the way marriage is defined today. Okay, I don't know if we talked about it up to this point in the series, but that's not how marriage is defined today. Marriage is very much so a contractual agreement between two parties. You know, it's a hey, I love you, you love me, we're better together, let's get married. And because marriage, and I just want you to know this, because marriage is defined this way, then the argument for marriage, our current argument for marriage, is a very logical argument for marriage. You know, if it's just a contract, if it's just a vow, if it's just really anybody and everybody should have the opportunity to make a vow of love to another person, be in a contractual agreement and union with them, and take their name, not take their name, whatever it may be, and become a married person. And that's how the state and government wants to define it. That's a whole other message for another day. That's how they're going to define it. But that is not the marriage relationship that Paul's talking about when he quotes Jesus, who quotes God the Father. That's not this covenant, this unbroken covenantal love that's described as the design of marriage. So understand, when we talk about marriage, I don't want you to just shut it off to the way marriage is discussed today. We're talking about the fullness of marriage, the fullness of the way God designed it to be for all of his kids, for everybody who would call him a Savior, who would call him God, who would want to bring him into their marriage. There is a oneness, there is a fullness that you can experience. But I can tell you this, after 23 years, right? 23 years, yeah? 23 years. After 23 years, and after lots of conversations with folks, it is one of the hardest things you'll ever try to engage this side of heaven. This side of heaven, one of the hardest things that you will try to navigate and experience the fullness of is to try to find and get and keep this oneness in your marriage. Why? Because in order to experience it, you got to get past two very broken, fractured people. You got two very broken people in a relationship, and you got to learn to work through that and let God have a work in that in order for you to experience the fullness of this oneness we're talking about. And so for you, I just want you to hear this today. This is the point of this message. As we've talked about marriage, this one is greater than two. As we talked about marriage in this series, I want you to hear today a message of hope, even though we're going to go down a few alleys that I understand that a lot of times people get into their marriage to places in their marriage where they feel really, really hopeless, especially when it comes to the stuff that matters, especially when it comes to deep connection, deep intimacy, closeness, that they just lose over a period of time, or they never had it maybe, that they can become a place of hopelessness. And I want you to know that there is hope for your marriage. There is hope, absolute hope, for what God can do. And all of it centers around this beautiful story. I want to walk us through this story first, but it's an account in John's gospel, when he talks about one of the first miracles, the first signs that Jesus performs and does to let everybody know he is who he says he is. Okay, that's the purpose of the 7 signs in the Gospel of John, the first few chapters, is the signs that Jesus is doing these miracles to let them know who he is and that he is who he says he is. And so the first one is at a wedding. It's at a wedding celebration. It's not at a ceremony. Many cultures, I know how it is in the States, it's the same way in Canada. The marriage is more like afternoon, quick pictures, 2 or 3 hour party, depending on how much money you have. 2 or 3 hour party, right? And then go home, and the couple wants to take a vacation and, start their life, right? So that's how we view it. But in many cultures, even today, there's a kind of celebration and gathering if his family travels a long way. And then there's a ceremony. And then there's sometimes even a week-long celebration of marriage. So that's the culture we're finding this story in context with in John 2. So if you want to look at John 2, you can look at your scripture. I'll put it on the screen for you. This is John 2 in the New Living Translation. It says, the next day, this is talking the story, there was a wedding celebration, so the celebration itself, the reception we call it, in the village of Cana in Galilee, and Jesus' mother was there. Okay, Jesus, you're going to find out later on, she's got a big part of the story. Jesus' mother was there. And Jesus and his disciples were also invited to the celebration. The wine supply ran out during the festivities, so Jesus' mother told him, they have no more wine. So this is, you have to have the inflection. They have no more wine. Now, dear woman, that is not our problem. Now, in some translations, it gets a little, it looks really disrespectful. Like, I think he says woman or something like that. Like, it's really, but if you get to the core of the context, Jesus' response is kind of one of these like, and? Mom freaks out and Jesus goes, and? Like, how is this our concern? So he says, Jesus replied, my time has not yet come, which he was actually speaking to his future. And then, but the mother, it's not disrespectful. The mother just kind of ignores Jesus, as most mothers do, adult children. Ignores him and says, hey, do whatever he tells you to do. Tells the servants, do whatever Jesus says. So, standing nearby were 6 stone water jars used for Jewish ceremonial washing. Each could hold about 20 to 30 gallons. Now, I want to stop here for a minute because this is an important part of the story. I want you to picture and have a proper picture in your mind, okay? In most homes in this time, this is a cultural thing, there was a lot of ceremonial washing in the Jewish culture. It was for priests, and then just because of their legalistic thinking, they sort of made it for everybody. It was an elbow down ritual, the elbow down, that when they entered a home, before they eat especially, they ceremonially cleaned themselves and washed off. And it was always a pitcher that poured over the hands into a sauce or a bowl, whatever the case is, and then they would dump that out and do it for the next person. But in this kind of situation, it says, look, there was 6 stone jars, about 25 to 30 gallons apiece. Show the picture. There are 6 stone jars. What we usually picture is these kind of finished big jars, these big finished jars. Again, pouring over the hands, and what's left over kind of goes into the jar. Well, this is a big celebration. There's 6 massive stone jars. Now, I pulled this up just for you to see. If you do an Israel tour, apparently you can go to Cana and you can go to the chapel. That's apparently the chapel where it happened. I have no idea if that's true. It's the chapel. It's where the wedding celebration would take place, and they actually have this all encased in glass because I guess it's blessed or something. This is one of the stone jars. Like this is what would have really looked like in the time of the wedding. So we're 6 of these. Okay, 6 of these, and I want you to see this because if Jesus is the hero of the story, the top of the supporting cast are the water jars. I just want you to know that up front. Okay, so here he is saying, look, there's 6 jars, and here's what Jesus tells them to do. Jesus tells the servants, go fill these jars with water. Then the jars had been filled, and when the jars had been filled, he said, now dip some out and take it to the master of ceremonies. Okay, think wedding planner. Okay, just think like more, that's who he's talking about. Go take it to the one in charge of the party. So the servants followed his instructions. This is where it gets good. When the master of ceremonies tasted what's the word? Say it out loud. When he tasted the water, right? That was what? Now wine. Not knowing where it had come from, and I love this parentheses, though of course the servants knew, right? He called the groom over. He called the bridegroom over. So this is the host of the party, or the man running the show. He calls the groom over. He calls it's his celebration, and he says this. The host always serves. What's these three words? The best wine first. Host always serves the best wine first, he says. Then, when everyone has had a lot to drink, other translations will say, when everyone gets intoxicated, when everybody's a little bit drunk, you bring the box wine out. Like, that's what you do. You bring out the less expensive wine. But you have, and read this last part of the sentence from them, but you have what? Kept the best until now. And then John says, this miraculous sign in Cana in Galilee was the first time Jesus revealed his glory. And his disciples believed in him. Yeah, one of the big things about the story that most people don't know, this is not like the feeding of the 5,000. This was not something as a massive public display of his glory and who he is. This was just for his guys. The only people that actually knew the miracle that had taken place at this point were Jesus' disciples and the servants, of course, who basically picked out water and kind of knew what happened. And they were the only ones. And so it wasn't this big, it was a huge miracle, but it wasn't for everyone. Does that make sense? And it's a big part of the story. It's a big part of the story. And so I want to walk through three observations. Again, this is observations for hope for oneness. When we talk about these fractures and these struggles in marriages, when it comes to intimacy or oneness, oftentimes, sometimes people get an idea in their mind of what intimacy means. So let me just break down some areas or elements, if you will, angles, if you will, of intimacy, of closeness, of deep connection. Like, it's the best word we have to describe the deepest of deep, right? The closest of close, the oneness that we're talking about here. There's four types, just four areas of intimacy that we can view it. Physical. So let's walk through these. Physical intimacy. Everybody knows what physical intimacy is. Hopefully, if I can't explain it to you, you're too young and I don't need to explain it to you, all right? Physical intimacy. It's the greatest gift outside of salvation that God ever gave to man. Can I get an amen at all? That's amen. That's right. It's the greatest gift ever. And that closeness, that physical intimacy that we see in Genesis, that was created for us, I'm telling you, when it's used in the context of how it was designed to be used, it's actually worship, believe it or not. Right? It's worship. And I say that all the time. That's not fuel for you to tell your spouse tonight, I guess you don't love Jesus enough, it's not for you there, right? But it is worship. It's worship because when we engage in what God designs for us, in the way in which he designed for us, living it out with a heart of gratitude, that is worship. That's what it is. So this physical closeness, this intimacy, this gift that he gave this marriage couple in this relationship, that was the closest you could be to anyone. And that's just one big part of intimacy. But it's not the only part. There's emotional intimacy. And emotional intimacy, when I say that, I want you to not just picture emotional connection, but that connection comes from this is the best way I describe it to some folks. It's one heart talking to another heart. That's emotional intimacy. One heart connecting and talking with another heart. When you hear couples, and I talked with couples for counseling, when you hear couples say, you just don't say, we don't talk that much anymore, that's not actually true. There's lots of words usually happening, right? It's the fact that one heart is not talking to another heart. A great practical book for this is The 5 Love Languages. We use that in our counseling as well by Chapman. It's a phenomenal book talking about how you give and receive, how everyone is different in terms of how they give and receive love, how one heart talks to another heart. And that is what creates, when they're talking well, when it's communication's high, it's what creates that emotional intimacy. But there's also relational intimacy. There's also how you relate to one another, how you enjoy one another, how you engage with one another, how you relate to one another. There's a closeness there. You've probably heard the cliche that your spouse is supposed to be not just your friend, but your what? Your best friend, right? Your best friend. It's because that closeness and relational intimacy is kind of this idea that you're the first person on the list that I want to spend the most time with, right? You're the one that I want to go away with. You're the one that I want to spend time with. You're the one that I want to spend most of my time relating to. That's relationship and relational intimacy. And then last is spiritual. Spiritual intimacy, where you are growing together, where not only, and we're talking about this in a minute, but not only is Christ the center of your life individually, but he's the center of your growth together in marriage. He's the center of everything. And so when that happens, you're growing together, you're experiencing things together. Even when God's working in one of you, he's really working in both of you. I tell people in counseling that, listen, God has a plan for your life and God has a plan for your life, but believe it or not, because of the way he views this oneness, he actually has a plan for your marriage that's beyond what he could ever have done in one person's life alone. Okay, that doesn't highlight marriage over being single. It's just saying that when God brings people together in this covenant relationship, there is a plan for that oneness that's there. That's different and different than the individual call. So there's spiritual intimacy. So these areas of intimacy. Now, one of the reason that I say this and help you want to see the ideas of how it breaks out is because usually, when I talk with folks and have counseling session with folks that are having trouble in their marriage, it's usually one of these two things that they're complaining about. It's usually physical or it's emotional. It's one of the first, it's one of those early signs on thing. But the reality is that one area of intimacy, it's like four wheels on a car, okay? One area of intimacy affects all the other areas. If you're losing it out in one area, it's going to show up in the others. If one tire goes flat, the whole car knows it. You guys, nod your head if you're with me on that, right? So to help you understand that sometimes you may be thinking your struggle with physical intimacy, but there's so many other things that are affecting that. And your struggle with emotional intimacy or spiritual intimacy, I can promise you, is affecting your physical intimacy. It's affecting your emotional connection. It's affecting your relationship with each other and your friendship. So that's the reason this is important. This is that, when it comes to this lens of closeness, of oneness, of intimacy that's centered in this covenant relationship with God and in marriage, when one thing is struggling, when one thing sort of taps out, when one thing dries up, it affects all the rest. And what usually happens in marriage is that we just start to lean on the one, like a car going flat. We lean on the tire that's still rolling pretty good, right? The one that maybe is a little more natural for us. Until eventually we have trouble in all areas. That's just usually what happens. And again, this is the hardest thing we'll engage in our life, in marriage, is to experience this fullness of oneness in every one of these areas. So when I pull out these observations from this passage, me and another friend, a pastor friend of mine, we started talking about this about 4 years ago. About 4 years ago, this just came up in a conversation. I believe it was just a revelation from God to him, and we just focused on this passage, and it has become a primary source. It's become a primary source of encouragement for me when I meet with other couples, is this picture, this story, what happened in this first miracle, this wedding at Cana, to bring hope to marriages that exist. Because and just again, this is no matter where you are in your journey. If you're young, this is the marriage, this is the stuff you're going to need to know for your marriage one day. Okay? If you're single again and you're dealing with the fractures of your past, you need to pay attention now so that what's coming in your future, what you gauge in your future, will be different than what you experienced in the past. And if you're married now, regardless of where you are, hopefully you're not at a place of hopelessness in one of these four areas. But if you are, I want you to know there's hope. So here's just a few observations from this beautiful picture, this beautiful illustration of what Jesus did in this wedding, that I believe can just really change marriages. And this first one is this. Jesus can be present in a marriage but not engaged at the center. The ceremony was done. Like they were already well into marriage before the wine ran out. And quite frankly, Jesus was present, right? He was at the wedding. He was there. But he wasn't really engaged. I mean, mom had to come engage him. He was at the wedding. He was enjoying the celebration, but he wasn't fully there. Like, he wasn't the center of attention. He wasn't the center of what was happening. He had to be pulled in. He was somewhat sidelined. And the reality is, for you and me, is that, quite frankly, I know a lot of marriages that have been strong at one point, and then they start to experience fractures in intimacy. They start to experience where things dry up and dry out, and then they realize that Jesus was never really the focus. That Jesus was never really the center. That they've been doing all this on their own. And for you and me, and maybe this happens spiritually, I see this happen more spiritually in terms of spiritual intimacy. I see this happen more often that this is the start of it. And listen, most of you, for some people, it's a full-on believing spouse and an unbelieving spouse. For some people, that's the degree that they're in. But for most people, I'll just be honest, usually when they get married, it's like the one person knows just enough spiritual language to kind of up their game a little bit, in the relationship. And the other person decides just to assume a lot, right? In terms of what's spiritually going to happen in their marriage. And then they come together and they get married. And they make their covenant and they make their promises. But the reality is they are not growing together spiritually. They're not growing individually spiritually. Jesus is not the center of their marriage because Jesus is not the center of their lives individually. And if he's not the center of your life, then it shows up everywhere. It shows up in your marriage. It shows up in the lack of this oneness because values aren't the same. Priorities aren't the same. Right? You got to start asking yourself, because here's the reason why. It shows up. The reason I say it shows up everywhere is and I'm trying to be careful. I'm trying to get a little PG in my head. But anyway, it shows up in the bedroom. When your physical intimacy is driven by your selfish need for getting your needs and wants, desires filled, you are working from a broken place. You are working from a place of brokenness. And if there's not a spiritual thing, a spiritual intimacy that's guiding you, it can get really unhealthy really fast. Same thing goes with emotional connection. Same thing goes with the relationship. Because when you have priorities and you put yourself first, you got to ask that question, who's on first, right? Who's on first in your physical, emotional? Is it just about what needs you're getting met and the friendship you don't have and the thing? I'm telling you, when all this happens, it's usually rooted in the fact that you are not together spiritually because Christ is not the center and the first thing in your life. And if he's not the first, this is hopefully, and again, it's not just for people who are, you're married to an unbelieving spouse. I'm talking about for every relationship in the room where, quite frankly, one person is pursuing their relationship with Christ and the other person thinks what they're doing is enough for all of them. And that happens all the time. Because one person may be pursuing and the other person goes, you know what, that's fine. I'll go to church for you. I'll help with you. I'm going to let you serve. I'll watch the kids so you can serve. And you're not both pursuing, and you're not both growing, and you're not experiencing a spiritual intimacy that's going to drive everything. He's not the first in your values as a parent. He's not the first thing in your time. He's not the first thing in your money. It shows up everywhere in your life when the spiritual intimacy is not there. But here's the great part. This is the part I love. Jesus only had to be invited. He's present. He's present and he's there. He just has to be invited to act. And what I love about this picture is not only could the bridegroom or the bride have come and invited Jesus to act, I think the answer would have still been the same. You can even receive this miracle. You can even receive God working in your life and marriage because somebody else interceded for you. And I can promise you, there's marriages in this room that you've gone further than you thought you could go. You've experienced some miracles in your own life, not because you asked for it, but because you had a mother or a brother or a mentor or a friend praying for you. God, do something in that life. Do something in that marriage. Do something with her. Do something with him. And may they see you at work in that marriage. That's what I love about the mom even coming and interceding for this bride and this bridegroom. Jesus can do it. He just got to be invited. There's an invitation that has to be extended to do a work and to come and be full center of what needs to happen. That's the hope that we can have. I'm telling you, many of you have already experienced that because people have interceded for you. But you have to be the one that actually asks, that actually engages at some point if you're going to make him the center and begin to experience that oneness and closeness that you long for. Now, second observation is this, that everyone will run out, right? Everybody's going to run out of the best of their own best wine, okay, eventually. Everyone will. Now, I love this. Looks like a normal bottle in my hands, but it's really not. This is a 3-liter bottle that we got. I don't party at home like this. I just want you to know. This is, I don't even know if this is good wine, but it's wine, okay? Here's the concept. Every marriage, and this is what we know is true, every marriage brings as much as they can and the best they can when they get married. Am I right? Nod your head if you know what I'm right. Right? I'm telling you, it's the best of you. It's the best of your affection. It's the best of your time. It's the best of your love that you can muster. Right? Ain't no mountain high enough. Right? That's what we're talking about. Everyone brings their best. That's even what the master of ceremony said to the groom. He said, everyone brings their best at the beginning, right? And then what happens, whether it's 1 year in or 5 years in or 11 years in, you start to phone it in a little bit. Your spouse doesn't get your best anymore. You run out of your best. And here's the reality, and I just want you to know this when it comes to a covenant relationship, is that you and Jesus might be present because we're Christians and we went to church and we wanted God to be a part. It was a Christian ceremony, but I'm telling you, the temptation is too strong for you and I to rely on what's natural for us. A natural affection, a natural, draw and attraction, a natural love. The way I love her is enough, and I'm telling you, at some point it's going to run out. And the way you love her is not going to be enough. You're going to run out of wine. You're going to run out of your best. You're going to substitute it with some cheap junk. And eventually it's going to be just water. But here's the hope, right? Here's the hope. His best is always better than your best. And you don't have to wait. If you know it ahead of time, that it's eventually going to run out. Like my best intentions, my best efforts, my best ability to love my spouse is going to run out. If I know that right now, I can just invite God to do the work right now. Throw my best stuff away because his stuff is better. The way that God can love my wife through me, his love through me, is better than I could ever muster to love my wife alone. When you understand this principle, when you understand that you're going to run out, everybody will eventually, physical, emotional, relational, spiritually, you're going to run out. You're going to run out on your own. But a covenant relationship, this covenant love, and this oneness was never meant to be alone with you and your spouse. It was meant to have him at the center, to not only be the goal in your life, but to be the fuel to get there. So when you know that ahead of time, you can say, you know what, just throw it out. I'm not going to throw it because it's not my bottle, but throw it out. Let the best come from him. That's what I love about that passage. It says, look, you save the best to last. You save the best to last. And I'll be honest with you, there's a lot of marriages. There's a lot of people even in this room today that you've experienced some incredible fractures. Fractures that other marriages didn't even get past the first speed bump. But you experienced some incredible fractures in your marriage, and it took years, and it took effort, and it took intention, and Christ had to be at the center of it. But I'll just be honest with you. What the world sees, what everybody else sees, is some of the best wine ever. Way better than you could have done on your own. And probably way better than you brought to the beginning. Everyone's going to run out of it eventually. Why not ask him to step in early? I mean, he does. It's not just the best. He brings more than you could possibly need, right? This bottle represents about 4 regular bottles of wine. Okay, Jesus, he made 190 of these bottles with those six jars. 190 of these. That's over 760 of the regular bottles of wine. Okay, more than you should be, more than you should ever need in your lifetime. Okay, should be. Let me put that in there. Should be more than you should ever need in your lifetime. He doesn't just bring the best, he brings more than you can ever need. But everybody's going to run out of it eventually. Why not know that now? Why not know that now and begin to make changes? Here's the third observation. And this is one of my favorite parts of this story, okay? Is that the worst vessels can always be redeemed. The worst vessels can always be redeemed. And this is the reason I wanted you to get the real context of what those jars really were. Okay, like the jars themselves, what Jesus, this thing that Jesus decides to do is not, he could have done it with anything, okay? Find a bunch of empty jars, bring them to, no. He says, take those 6 jars. Those 6 jars that for the week-long celebration had been collecting all of the contaminated crap that people brought in with them. Like those are the jars that when you wash, they wash their hands. All that crap and junk went in there and just sat there in all those 6 jars. And Jesus says, no, take those 6 jars. Take the worst possible thing in terms of a vessel or an object. Take the worst thing that's here, and I'm going to bring the best out of it. Fill it with water. I can only imagine the servants filling it with water. This is disgusting, right? And then they got to pour some, and they got to cup some out and take it to the master of ceremonies, which I can only imagine their mind was like, they're going to get us fired. Like Jesus is pulling a joke. And yet when he gives it to them, it is the best wine. So, just understand that this is a big deal for me. There is nothing about your circumstances. There is nothing about your past. There is nothing about your current life. There's nothing about the fractures in your life, the contaminated junk and crap that's in you that he can't fill with himself and make better than you could possibly imagine. It's just the way it is. Now, you got to invite him. You got to invite him from being present to being engaged at the center. Abandon what you think is your best, because it's going to run out eventually. I'm telling you, it doesn't matter who you are, who you have been, or what's happened. There can be healing. There can be redemption. And I love the fact that he could take the worst stuff, the stuff that you and I wouldn't possibly imagine drinking from. And it can be a fountain of life to those around them. They didn't even know. They didn't even know where this amazing wine came from. What an incredible testimony. What an incredible picture of the gospel, right? Of what he does in our lives. Here's why it matters. Let me just end with this. Let me end with this thought. Here's why it matters so much to us at Journey. Why do we spend a few weeks talking about marriage, especially from the context of how God designed marriage to be, about the oneness that you and I could experience together, about the reflection that we are in our marriage. The reality is this, is that still to this day, the greatest picture of love is in the marriage relationship. Okay? That's it. There's a lot of pictures of love with parents and kids, and across the world. But across the world, weddings are still the most celebrated events of the picture of love in all of our globe, in all countries. It's still the most pictured event. The most celebrated event of a picture of love. And Jesus, when he was with his guys and he wanted them to know, he had already boiled down 633 laws to summarize them to 2. But right before he left, he said, look, there's something really important you need to know. It's going to be the only covenant I'm going to give you. It's the covenant command that I want you to keep. And he said this, your love for one another will prove to the world that you're my disciples. The way in which you love one another is going to prove to the world that you're mine. Now that was a verse to everyone. That was a command to everyone that would follow Jesus. And the only thing that hits me is that, well, how much more does my marriage, the love that I express in my marriage, which is the pinnacle of how love is expressed in our world, how much more important then is the reflection of my marriage and the love that I have for my spouse? Help other people see that we belong to God. And so here's what I'll end with, and just a question in your mind. Listen, if you're married, your marriage reflects something. It does. It is a reflection of something. And maybe it's you're young and you're young in your years of marriage, and it's still reflecting the best of what you've brought to the table. Maybe that's it. But for most that have been married for a while, your marriage is a reflection of the best things that you want people to see, but the reality is that people can already see the areas of brokenness and fracture and the areas where the wine's gone. It's gone. The intimacy in those areas are all but dried out. And that's what we show the world. And let's face it, quite frankly, the majority of believers have kind of just joined the world and basically saying, yeah, marriage doesn't work. It sometimes works, but most of the time it doesn't work. That's the reflection we've given to the world in terms of the covenant love that we say is supposed to tell people that we're his. So your marriage is going to be a reflection of something. What do you want it to be a reflection of? And I'm selfish. I want my marriage to be a reflection of how much God loves us. And that's the only way, hear that, the only way sometimes that Tracy and I can love each other, right? It's the only way sometimes. Because I can get very unloving really fast. I can get really unlovable for her really fast. Because we're two broken people in this relationship. But I want our reflection. I want our reflection to be that of one of who, not only who we belong to, but the image of God in our marriage. But it takes work, and it takes time, and it takes an intentionality. But here's the payoff. The payoff is that there's hope. That for a long time, we've been spending a lot of time with Christ at the center of our marriage, asking him constantly to take what we think is our best and throw it away and give us what he has because we know it's better. Like, Jesus is a much better parent than we will ever be to our children. I just want you to know that, right? I mean, across the board, he's a much better friend than we would be to our friends. He's a much better, helpmate than we are to each other. He's a much better partner. He's a much better lover. He's a much better everything than we will ever be to each other. We need him at the center of our lives in order for him to be the reflection we want people to see. But your marriage reflects something. What do you want it to reflect? Just know, no matter where you are, that's one of the reasons I love this passage. No matter where you are, there's hope. He's either sidelined and you just need to ask him and engage him into the center of your life, individually and in your marriage. You're still functioning off of a few areas of your life that's the best you can do and the best you can bring, and you need to abandon that path and let Jesus just take over. And maybe you have experienced some really ugly stuff. Maybe there's some fractures and stuff in your marriage and in you personally that you've almost given up hope that there's going to be, that you could even experience the fullness of oneness with another person. Because you've hurt them and they've hurt you and there's been betrayal and fractures and hurt. I'm just telling you, there is an absolute hope, and his name is Jesus, for your marriage. We know this to be true. And we see it in this story, that he is who he says he is. And he can do above and beyond in your marriage. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, we thank you for today. I love the way your word encourages us and challenges us in ways that sometimes we never even considered before, that there can be something as simple as this miracle that isn't even a big public miracle, but it's such a phenomenal miracle that we look at the way in which you did it, the way in which you chose to do it for this one couple, and God, we know you can do it for us. We know you can do it for every marriage in this room. And so, God, my prayer today is simple, that in any area of intimacy, any area of oneness, of closeness, where anyone here or listening later online, any one of those areas, God, where they feel that they've run out and there's nothing but water left, God, I pray, and they've been hopeless in it, I pray, God, that you are moving them because of your word. You are moving them to a place that there is hope for their marriage. That there is hope for this oneness, this intimacy, because you are at the center. God, I pray for what needs to be done, for the repentance and the confession and the even as Zach said last week, the working through the hurt that needs to happen in order for folks to get to experience the fullness of this. God, I'm praying for everyone today that needs to take those steps. May you just infuse us. May this be just a catalytic event in our lives when we make the decision to invite you in, ask you to do a work that only you can do in our marriages. And God, I pray that whether it's today and as it continues on for years to come, that you would be more and more of a reflection in the marriages here at this church and the marriages of your church as a whole. That God, that we may not get a lot of things right as Christians and believers, but if we can get this area right, God, what a testimony to the world we could be of who you are and how much you love us, because that's the way we love each other. We pray all of this, God, in your name, Jesus. Amen.